Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third of our Swing Time talk series. This is a series that was conceived in order to celebrate the cleaning and restoration of Fragonard's famous painting, The Swing, one of the most revered works in the Wallace Collection, and indeed one of the most representative works of the entire French 18th century. We invited five art practitioners and 5 scholars to participate in a series of virtual conversations inspired by its key themes: pink, identity, fashion, play, and the Libertine. In order to explore the theme of fashion, I'm joined by fashion designer Sami Nouri, curator Jessica Degain, and special guest fashion historian Hayley Edwards-Dujardin. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Learning Department for their support of this series, and most of all, my colleague, Félix Zorzo, acting curator of French decorative arts, who has been very much involved in bringing this project to fruition, and with whom I share many interests on the continuing influence of the Rococo. I'm showing you here the painting in its various stages of restoration, and as you can see, the transformation has been nothing short of completely revelatory and dramatic. And now to introduce our guests. Sami Nouri was born in Afghanistan, where he learned sewing with his father. Forced to leave his country, he arrived in Tours at the age of 14. Following apprenticeships with John Galliano and Jean-Paul Gaultier, he founded his own haute-couture studio in 2017. In 2022, at the invitation of the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Tours, he will create a costume inspired by the painting of François Boucher that will figure in the exhibition. And I think we'll be hearing about that a little bit further on. We're also joined by Jessica Degain, a graduate of Paris's prestigious École du Louvre. She is the curator at the Musée des Beaux-Arts of Tours, where she oversees the museum's collections of 17th, 18th, and 19th century painting. Previously, she was in charge of conservation and restoration of the collections of Parisian churches. She was a contributor to the major exhibition Le Baroque des Lumières, chef-d'œuvre des églises parisiennes au XVIIIe siècle, which was held at the Petit Palais. And she's currently working on the exhibition that I just mentioned about François Boucher and his contributions to theater and the opera. And that will take place in 2022. Finally, we're joined by special guest Hayley Edwards-Dujardin, who also graduated from the École du Louvre and the London College of Fashion. She is now an independent fashion and art historian. She teaches fashion theory and visual culture in Paris and is the author of the book collection Ça c'est de l'art, including a recently published book about pink in art. She's participated in the research project Rechercher la mode, so researching fashion, and she recently published as a co-editor Fashion, Society, and the First World War. She's currently working on an extensive book about 20th and 21st century fashion. So I am going to start with Jessica. In our last 2 conversations that we've held as part of the Swing Time series, we've been heavily focused on the iconography of the swing. We've looked closely at the color palette in our talk on pink, and we thought about the codes used throughout the painting in our talk on identity. Now we're stepping back and thinking more about the context of the era and Fragonard's influences, notably contemporary fashion as it was translated in the art of François Boucher. Jessica, I know that François Boucher and his great patron, Madame de Pompadour, had huge influences on French fashion. Can you describe their relationship for us?
Yes, so François Boucher is today known as a great painter. He was a master of Fragonard and the first painter of the King Louis XV. And he was also very much appreciated by the Marquise de Pompadour, the favorite of Louis XV. He made for her several paintings, especially this portrait, in which she appears in a very elegant and refined fabric and ornaments. And this shows one of the points we're going to explain in this conversation, the fact that Madame de Pompadour has been at the forefront of fashion in France and Europe. And François Boucher and Madame de Pompadour also had in common a passion for opera and theater. And this is a little known fact that Boucher actively contributed to performing arts. He made sketches for costumes and sets and worked for different kinds of theaters. Of course, the Royal Academy of Music in Paris, the ancestor of the opera, but also the court theater in Versailles and the much more popular Fairground Theater. And Madame de Pompadour also loved a lot theater and opera, and she was a gifted actress, singer, and dancer. And she played in Versailles and commissioned Boucher paintings to celebrate her shows.
And so I think it's interesting to give our viewers a sense of the French stage at this time period. This is a work that I accidentally just previewed, but we're seeing it again now. This is what a typical performance would have looked like at the time. Is that right?
Exactly, yes. This drawing depicts a comedy ballet played in Versailles in 1745 for the wedding of the Dauphin and the Spain infant. And it's a very interesting document because it helps us to have a better idea of what theaters looked like at this time. So what we can see here is the stage with actors playing, and they are surrounded by spectators and a spectacular set with, for example, this sailing with an illusionistic sky, creating a magical atmosphere. So basically, it's a phenomenon of a mise en abîme. And so even before the show starts, the audience was already immersed in a fantasy world.
It's fascinating. And then what are we looking at here?
So here we have an important depiction of Madame de Pompadour playing Acis and Galatea in Versailles in 1749. She's playing the role of the nymph Galatea, and we also can identify a partner, the Vicomte de Rohan, playing Acis, and above them the Cyclope Polypheme, who is jealous of Acis and is about to throw a rock to kill the shepherd. But what's interesting in this painting is also the audience in the room, and we can also recognize the royal family, for example, Louis XV, but also the queen and the daughters just in front of the mistress of the king, and the beautiful settings of this ephemeral theater, des Petits Cabinets de Versailles, made by Boucher himself, with these blue and golden rocaille ornaments, decorations on the wall.
It's an amazing document, and I have to say I feel so sorry for the poor queen who was watching the mistress perform on stage, but I guess Madame de Pompadour really is the star here. So let's see, do we have many drawings by Boucher for theater and opera costumes?
Actually, not so many. Boucher worked a lot for opera during his life, almost all his life long, and especially for the Royal Academy of Music during 30 years, between 1737 and 1767. And so it was very prolific, but unfortunately very few remain of his production. Why? Because costumes and sets were made for short-lived shows and were often reused and changed to fit to other representations. So here are some of the rare examples remaining of this production. And on the left side, we can see a setting for Aline, Reine de Golconde, for the Academy Royale of Music in Paris in 1766. And we can admire this Chinese decoration. And in the center, in the middle, we have an example of costume made by Boucher for Army, another spectacle, another show for the opera. And with this very specific costume, male costume. It's like a skirt, but it was worn by men. And we can see this costume on this painting of Fragonard, which has probably been to the opera and probably seen the show. But in the painting of Fragonard, the costumes worn by women are not realistic at all because half-naked women were just impossible on stage at the time.
Okay, that's really fascinating. And so how about here?
So this gouache of Gabrielle de Saint-Aubin is definitely a more trustworthy testimony of Boucher's costumes for armies than Fragonard's painting.
Okay.
Indeed, here Saint-Aubin depicts real costumes worn at this time by actors, especially by women. So we can see these very big dresses, very large dresses, not convenient at all, we can imagine, for dance and sing. And the gouache also reveals the sets, apparently also made by Boucher, because the pattern, the architecture is taken from his reception piece at the Academy in 1734. And at least we could spend a lot of time looking at this beautiful gouache because there are so many details in it. And for instance, we can notice the policeman in the crowd in charge of the order and security.
It's also amazing in that we really understand the extent to which the stage is surrounded by the audience. So it gives the impression, it conveys the sense that this was indeed a very immersive experience, that the audience was positioned very close to the actors.
Absolutely, yeah. Also because at this time there's no electricity, only candlelight. So actors had to be very close to.
Right, of course. Of course, that's fascinating. And here we come to the raison d'être for your forthcoming exhibition that we're all very much looking forward to.
Yes, we are very lucky too to have these masterpieces of François Boucher. And when I arrived at the museum in 2020, I discovered that these paintings had in common opera and theater. They reveal Boucher's and Madame de Pompadour's love for performing arts. And so they definitely are the starting point of this idea of an exhibition exploring Boucher's contribution to opera and theater.
And this is also a work that will be in your exhibition?
Yes, this is one of the 4 paintings of Boucher we have. And this one shows Apollon crowning the arts. It's supposed to be a project for stage curtain, maybe for the opera of the Palais Royal in Paris after the fire of 1763. But we have to say that the topic is quite common at this time for theater sets. So it also could be for another theater.
Okay. And then these are 2 of the other works that inspired your thinking.
Yes, so we also have these 2 paintings belonging to a series of 4 called today the series of Sylvia. And the 4 paintings were commissioned by Madame de Pompadour to keep the memory of her role as Sylvia in Versailles in 1749. And they were made by Boucher in 1766, probably to decorate the castle of Crécy, a property of Madame de Pompadour. The story is taken from a 16th century book of the Italian poet Lutas and tells us the complicated love story of Sylvia, a nymph of the goddess Diana, and Aminta. So what we see on the right side of the slide is Sylvia running from a wolf. And on the left side, it's the following episode when Sylvia finally falls in love with Aminta after Aminta attempted suicide, thinking that Sylvia was dead because of the wolf.
Okay, and then these are the other 2 works from the same series. Is that right?
Yes, I can see them. So, yeah. So indeed, the other 2 are today in the Banque de France. And what's very important for us is that the set of the 4 paintings will be gathered in Tours for the first time since the 18th century for our exhibition. So it's
That's remarkable. What a coup. It's very exciting. So Jessica, is it appropriate to talk of portraits in these paintings? Can we see these as portraits of Madame de Pompadour?
No, we can't say that, because contrary to other paintings by Boucher, the series of Sylvia is not portraits of Madame de Pompadour.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so if these aren't portraits, are they realistic in any way? Is this how actors and actresses appeared on stage? I know you said it was sort of inappropriate to show any flesh, so I'm assuming not.
Exactly, yes. We have here half-naked women, so it's not real in costume. And at the contrary, on stage we had at this time women wearing very heavy dresses like court costumes. And on the contrary, here we have more an idealistic vision close to pastoral and mythology with of course, a touch of eroticism.
So do we have any idea of what the actual costumes for Sylvie looked like?
Unfortunately, to my knowledge, nothing remained in France, but we can have a look on the costume of a savage. This costume was worn by the future king of Sweden in 1778 for a play called The Party of Dinah. And here we can notice fake fur, which was a very common element costume for characters of pastorals. And what's interesting is we find an exact match in the painting of Boucher with Aminta with this fur.
It's really wonderful. It's amazing. And is this a design for so are we looking at what are we looking at on the left? Is this a design for a costume of Sylvie or another role?
Yeah. What we see here is a drawing, not by Boucher, but by his pupil, Louis Bouquet. And the costume was worn by a famous dancer called Marie Allard. And that's what we see on the right side of the slide. So it's very interesting because it proves that the costumes were really made and worn with this fake fur also for women.
Yeah, I see that. That's so interesting. But then here, maybe we're looking at portraits. Is that the case?
Absolutely, yes. So contrary to the Sylvia series, the last painting of Tours is a real portrait of Madame de Pompadour. So the painting was also commissioned by the Marquise, this time to commemorate her play at Versailles as Issei in 1749. The opera tells the final love between the nymph Issei and the god Apollon. And in the show, Apollon, of course, was played by the Vicomte de Rohan, but in the painting of Boucher, contrary to the face of Madame de Pompadour, the Vicomte de Rohan is not a real portrait. Why? Because this painting was supposed to see only by Madame de Pompadour and the king in a castle of Crécy, so no competition was absolutely.
Of course. Okay. Of course, there's also a strong visual link between the way in which the figures are represented and in the Wallace Collection's major paintings by Boucher. And I wondered if you could comment on that, because I don't know if a portrait was intended in the Wallace's pictures, but would be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes, what's interesting here is the painting of Tours is very close to the one of the Wallace Collection, was made a few years later. And it shows that our painting is a little bit surprising because it's supposed to be a testimony of a real opera, but it rather looks like to a mythological scene. And it's like yeah, a mythological thing with a superimposed picture of the face of Madame de Pompadour inside it. So it's a little bit weird, but very interesting.
That's so interesting. It's a sort of visual joke, maybe specifically for her as the patron. So do we have any idea of the real costume worn by Madame de Pompadour for this role in Issei?
Well, unfortunately, to this question, we have no clear answer, but it was probably very similar to the sketch of Boucher for another opera called Titon et l'Aurore. And what we see is actually the costume was very close to the dress worn by Madame de Pompadour in this portrait of the Wallace Collection. And this is no coincidence because scene costumes at this time came from court clothes, because historically dance was performed by gentry. And obviously, once again, dresses were very pretty, but not convenient at all to play, to dance, to sing, because once again, of the use of heavy textiles, of corsets, paniers, wigs, and accessories.
Okay. So, rather than theater, it's actually Madame de Pompadour herself who provides a link to the contemporary world, thanks to her love of fashion.
Yes, through this portrait, Madame de Pompadour is represented as a savant, a protector of philosophers and artists, but also as a very fashionable woman. And she's wearing the famous robe à la française, so typical of French fashion under Louis XV. And as we know, the dress quickly spread into European courts to become the elite robe. Madame de Pompadour played an important role in this phenomenon because she's probably the most portrayed woman at this time. No other woman, even the queen, was more depicted than her, probably because she had a huge need of social affirmation, being not noble and only the mistress of the king. And as Hayley told me, there's a big contrast between the Rococo aesthetic, very smooth, very sensual, and the reality of wearing this kind of dress, incredibly uncomfortable and putting women like in a cage. So we can imagine it's maybe a reaction of patriarchy at a time women were having a social cultural power through silence.
That's really interesting.
And nevertheless, the robe à la française has become today iconic of Madame de Pompadour herself, as we can see in the costumes by Jérôme Kaplan, made for a Feu musical in the Comédie Française in 2004. So the gown is inspired of the 18th century fashion, with a portrait of Madame de Pompadour by Maurice Quentin de la Tour. And the shape is very accurate to what dresses really looked like at this time, with a geometrical shape, almost square. But at the same time, this dress of Kaplan is also modernized by the asymmetrical blues.
And here we have another example of Kaplan's costumes and sets. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. This picture is very interesting because it shows another example of Jérôme Kaplan contributions for opera, here for costumes and sets, for a modern adaptation of Sylvia in Houston in 2029. And we can see immediately the difference from costumes worn in the 18th century.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was absolutely fascinating and gives us a really wonderful picture of the role of fashion and opera and theater at this time period. And so now we're going to turn over to Hayley, who will be taking us out of the 18th century and discussing the Rococo's influence on fashion today.
Yes, well, what's interesting to notice is that this Rococo fashion, or more widely 18th century fashion, is going to be very influential as early as the 19th century. So very quickly, I just wanted to show two examples. We have a dress on the left, which is a typical shape of the 1830s fashion, the romantic fashion, as we called it. And it's a perfect transition to what we just saw, because this fashion was all about looking like a prima ballerina almost. A woman would dress up with ballet, sort of ballet flats and these very romantic shapes. And where we see this, the elements of Rococo fashion is via tones, this sort of very pastel, pinky tones, something very light, very airy in appearance, of course, because as we saw with 18th century fashion, the shapes are still quite heavy to wear. We have layers and layers of underskirts, but in appearance, it looks light. And the same thing as we move forward on the right with the mid-19th century crinoline, which also was a sort of reminiscent of the 18th century shape. So of course it's adapted and it's an evolution, it's not similar, but we can see the influence, and it's not a coincidence, because Libertine Eugénie, who was the major fan of crinoline fashion, was a huge admirer of Marie Antoinette, and so she really wanted to repeat styles that echoed the 18th century. And further on in the 20th century, we see sort of moments like that in fashion, modern fashion, where we are once again reviving history. Mm-hmm. And we have the 1920s, for example, with Jeanne Lanvin on the left, with what we called la robe de style, which borrowed from, especially from the skirt, not the upper part, but the skirt borrowed from 18th century shapes. And there again, we have the very pastel tones, something very delicate, almost naive and candid, almost childish, actually, in a way. And also post-war Christian Dior, who in 1947 is going to design what we like to call the new look. But actually, there's nothing very new here, because he is reviving historical shapes. But what we always have to insist on is that although we are inspired by historical forms and motifs, we are still creating a new fashion. It's as if history was serving modernity and novelty, and we designers are creating a sort of new temporality via historicism. And that's always very interesting. It's something that's going to be very present also in contemporary fashion.
It's fascinating also to think about the way in which they are playing with history. And I just wonder, how, obviously someone like Eugénie was very conscious of her link with Marie Antoinette and really kind of setting that up and maybe playing with that a bit in her self-imaging. I wonder to what extent we know whether people like Jeanne Lanvin or Dior were conscious of constructing those same links, or whether they were just fans of the aesthetic.
Well, I think for Jeanne Lanvin, there's something that has to do. She was a very important art collector, and she loved going to the museum. So I think she was very infused by history of art. But the key inspiration was actually the world of childhood. She created dresses for women that looked like dresses for little girls. So this naive aesthetic came from there. But for Dior, for Christian Dior, he was really a huge admirer of the 18th century. And if some people know the boutiques, the Christian Dior boutiques often borrow to neoclassical decorative arts. And so it was very present in his work in general.
Okay, thank you. And so here we fast forward a little bit to the 1980s.
Yes, we like to call the 1980s the second age of golden age of haute couture, like the 1950s were the first age. And we're really in this very good example of how eclectic and historical references have really invaded fashion, and some designers have captured historicism to create new designs. And Christian Lacroix, for example, was one of these designers, and obviously Vivienne Westwood, illustrates these influences very well. But once again, the context says it all as well, because we're in the 1980s, especially the first part of the 1980s is a period of a very rich economy. There's a lot of a sense of materialism that's very present. And there's this sort of birth of a new financial aristocracy. And this financial aristocracy lives a bit like the aristocracy of the 18th century, where we see the same codes and values. And so it's quite obvious finally that fashion is going to reflect this economical and social context. And so since we are dressing this new aristocracy, well, why not make her wear the same dresses and gowns as women from the 18th century? And so Vivienne Westwood is going to have fun with that. But Vivienne Westwood comes from a punk background. So although she's creating aristocratic forms, there's always this sort of very deconstructed and subversive aesthetic. We can see it with the dress on the left, which is a reinterpretation of the dress we saw earlier in the portrait of Madame de Pompadour by François Boucher. So the shape is the same, but here we have this sort of electric pink, very flashy pink, and the silver lace. So she's deconstructing it. She's making it recognizable. It's identifiable, but she's making it her own. And it also is a pretext to question the female form, the body, its expression, and sexuality, of course, because since we speak of Rococo and libertinage, we have this sort of fantasy of strong eroticism being infused by these historical fashions as well.
And there's definitely a very sort of hypersexualization of the figure on the left. And whether willing or not, I love the fact that the photographer has captured this very knowing look on her face as well. It sort of goes perfectly with the whole sort of aesthetic that she's modeling. And of course, Vivienne Westwood, who's shown at the Wallace Collection in the image on the top right, is also very, she plays with sort of very modern approaches to fashion in her use of things like repetition and sort of this playing with consumer culture in a way that is interesting because it sort of, to my mind anyway, cuts against the haute couture aesthetic of really taking care and taking a lot of time. Here it feels like there's a sort of repetition that goes against the idea of the specialness maybe that haute couture designers tried to
yeah, definitely. I think she's like I said, since she comes from this punk background, there's also this will to, on one hand, legitimate her place and, affirm that she belongs to fashion and fashion craftsmanship and couture. But also, I think she wants also to play with the codes of fashion, since she has this irreverent past and personality. And she does bring together, as you say, this sort of consumer culture, but also an idea of trivializing, democratizing art via fashion, using fashion to make art very accessible, funny, because you can wear a painting by François Boucher as a scarf or as a corset or dress. And so I think it's also, there's something very, making it very accessible and very approachable, because some people don't feel like they are welcomed in museums or galleries. And so, she's bringing it to everyone in a way. And I think that's a very interesting concept.
Absolutely. And then you mentioned her use of the corset.
Yes, the corset, there's a double discourse because, as we said, it summarizes everything. She's, on one hand, proposing this art piece, it was entitled the Portrait Collection, so it was very willingly referencing the inspirations she had from the Wallace Collection. But it also is, the painting is set on a corset, and it's clearly not an innocent piece of clothing because it carries so much symbolism, often seen as a sort of symbol of masculine domination on women's bodies. And Vivienne Westwood is reverting this discourse and making it more an empowering, finally, piece of clothing where women are reclaiming their own sexuality, their own desirability, and transforming underwear as outerwear. Also, this is something very present in the fashions of the 80s and 90s. And there's this punk heritage once again, because punk also had to do a lot with fetishism and sexual objects. And so she's mingling all her personal and collective references and creating these pieces as the corset. And we can also make a parallel with the work of Jean-Paul Gaultier, whose corset we see worn by Madonna on the right. And here again, he also played a lot with underwear becoming outerwear. And it's a stance, it's a powerful message also for female empowerment. There's a strong erotic dimension. And we can notice that the corset is in sort of this very satin powdered pink. So he keeps the sort of the fantasy of femininity as we see it in its most stereotyped ways, but it has this conical bra. It's very, she looks very powerful and very delicate at the same time. So there's sort of masculine versus feminine cliches brought together here.
And given what Jessica was saying earlier about the kind of duality in sort of holding women's bodies in these dresses that are so, kind of associated with the Rococo, that are very constrictive and maybe, sort of represent a kind of social power dynamic. I think it's also quite meaningful that he's kind of liberating the corset, if you will, and really kind of bringing it back into the sort of in support of women.
Exactly.
And kind of real, yeah.
Yeah, and the Vivienne Westwood corset may not look like it, but it's actually very comfortable because it's supple, it's made of lycra, it has a zip in the back, so it has removed all the, the constraining elements. And it's this time, it's the corset that is adapting itself to the body. The body makes the form, whereas before it was rather the other way around.
I hadn't realized that about her corsets. That's fascinating. I'll have to try one out. So moving on from, well, maybe not so much moving on from kind of this idea of play and layering with the past. We have here a dress that to my eye looks as if it was plucked right out of the swing. And I think that the comparisons and also the hat that she's wearing are just astounding. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it's a dress made by John Galliano for Christian Dior, where he had arrived in 1996. I mean, it must seem very absurd to us today, but it was a huge scandal that an Englishman could be the designer of this iconic French couture house. So his introduction within the house was already quite subversive in itself. And John Galliano, probably because he has this heritage from English fashion, Vivienne Westwood, played with multicultural and historical references and layering, as you said. And as you said, you immediately identify this dress, and it is clearly borrowed from the swing, but yet it's not the same dress at all. And he is layering the 19th and the 18th century, because actually the skirt has more to do with the 19th century crinoline. The sleeves are more reminiscent of Belle Époque, Edwardian sleeves. So he's playing with all these codes, but yet your eye has identified what he wanted you to identify, this sort of pop culture / history reference. And it was very playful, because it's something we tend to forget to say, but fashion is supposed to be fun and playful. It's the spectacle de la mode, the fashion spectacle. And John Galliano really dived very thoroughly within this fashion spectacle and had fun with it.
Absolutely. I think it's here where, again, even in that idea of the spectacle and the way in which he is playing with this sort of feeling as if a painting is coming to life, it is just echoing so in such an interesting way themes from Jessica's comments earlier. And then here, so here we're coming right up to the very recent era with Dior.
Yes. Well, I wanted to just follow up with Dior because it is in the DNA of the Dior house, as I said earlier, with Christian Dior and his passion for the 18th century. And we can see how the different creative directors of the brand have always, in their very own personal way, referenced the 18th. And here we have Raf Simons, who's very famous for his very minimalist, almost abstract designs. And he manages to call on history because he's working for Dior, so we have to have this historical hint, but he makes it very abstract and almost futuristic. And that brings us back to what I said earlier, is how history can serve a very contemporary aesthetic. Finally, we have a foot, in 2014 for this collection, despite this historical reference. And I think this balance between both is always very interesting to observe.
Absolutely. And then Chanel also, I think that idea of the kind of the spectacle, the theater, I love this image because it reminds me so much of one of the first images that we looked at, the 18th century theater.
Yes, exactly. It's a spectacle de la mode, theatralization of fashion in its best, I suppose.
And of course, Karl Lagerfeld is someone similar to some of the other designers that we've been evoking, who was incredibly sensitive to the Rococo and 18th century aesthetic, and also I think an important art collector.
Yes, he was. He truly was a very fine connoisseur of this period, and he was a sponsor for the Chateau de Versailles, and he collected 18th century fashion. So it's a very personal culture that he has around this era. And so he brought it into his work for the Chanel house. And if we observe different Chanel shows, there's often been these references to the 18th century. And this show in particular from 2019 is interesting because it has a very, very precise inspiration. It actually wanted to look at the work of craftsmanship during the 18th century, and more precisely how La Marquise de Pompadour had been a patron to the porcelain manufacturers. And he wanted to reference, for example, if we look at the dress in the lower part of the slide, the porcelain flowers that she had asked the manufacturer de Vincennes to create for her home. So here we're really looking at very, very detailed references. And it is quite elitist, we must admit, because, I mean, if I didn't know, if I was in the public that day during the show, I would have never known. I would have not told myself, oh yeah, of course, these are porcelain flowers that the Marquise de Pompadour had ordered in the 18th century. So he's really addressing himself to the connoisseur. And this is the difference with Vivienne Westwood. Like, we have haute couture, haute culture. It's for a happy few. It's not for everyone to understand. And he's affirming, this sort of higher end of high couture and high fashion.
I love that phrase, haute couture, because it's perfect in the way in which it sort of defines how, I mean, his work is so beautiful, but it does feel, as you say, it's sort of for a very select few, and very kind of, there's an intellectualism that is wrapped up in it that I think is almost palpable. And then from there to the use of denim in Vivienne Westwood, which is yet another sort of twist on the sort of democratization of fashion.
Yes, well, we're completely opposing ourselves to what we just saw. We're not anymore in ready-to-wear. We're now into streetwear. Vivienne Westwood has gone a step further in this democratization of fashion and art, and applying these art pieces on such a trivial fabric as denim, I think is a very powerful message. And I also like the fact, this is something I noticed immediately, that there is a Black woman wearing these designs. I think it's also a very powerful message, because we know that history of art and history of fashion tend to be quite Eurocentric. And there's a way of sort of decentralizing the discourse by having this woman wear art and wearing fashion that tend to sometimes invisibilize certain cultures and communities. And here she's taking this stance, this very powerful stance of having this new iconography, this renewed iconography for art and fashion. And I think that's really interesting and important for the future of fashion.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Hayley. This was, again, just fascinating and gives us a incredibly strong kind of, and I think very hopeful message about the way in which fashion and art use each other, and hopefully we'll kind of continue to cross-pollinate into the future. And to tell us a little bit about that, we are joined by fashion designer Sami Nouri, who is a sort of growing star in the fashion world, a haute couture designer, as I said, and one who comes with just an absolutely incredible backstory. So we're going to have the privilege of hearing about that now. Sami Nouri, pouvez-vous nous raconter votre histoire?
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Bon, bah, en fait, comme la dernière fois, je ne suis pas quelqu'un qui parle beaucoup, mais comme je vous ai expliqué, je suis né en Afghanistan et j'ai beaucoup voyagé. Après, je suis allé en Iran, j'ai vécu en Iran, et là, ça fait depuis 2011, je suis arrivé en France. Et j'ai vécu pas mal de choses dans dans différents pays, différentes cultures. Et en fait, après, voilà, pour vous dire que j'ai jamais été à l'école, j'ai toujours travaillé depuis l'âge de 8-9 ans, je commençais à travailler, et j'ai travaillé avec mon père dans la mode, dans la couture. Et quand je suis arrivé en France à l'âge de 18 ans, j'ai lancé une marque de vêtements. Et en fait, là, depuis quelques années que j'ai créé ma société, je participe à la Fashion Week. Et normalement, cette semaine, la semaine prochaine qui arrive, je lance une marque de prêt-à-porter e-commerce. Je vous ai fait un résumé rapide.
Merci, c'est absolument incroyable. Et est-ce que vous pouvez nous commenter un peu vos collections? Donc là, on montre une robe qui vient de la collection la collection Exode, qui est nommée, je crois, d'après cette histoire que vous venez de nous raconter. Et oui, donc c'est une robe haute couture.
En fait, exactement. Quand j'ai commencé à lancer ma marque, première collection que j'avais fait, j'ai fait sur le thème d'Exode parce que j'avais inspiré de tous les voyages que j'ai fait, parce que je suis arrivé en France, mais pas en avion directement, parce que j'ai passé des pays, j'ai passé des frontières, et voilà, et j'avais inspiré de mon histoire. Et surtout que l'Exode aussi, c'était, comment on dit, mon signature sur les vêtements, c'était les barbelés. Parce que chaque frontière que j'ai passée, ça veut dire que voilà, il y avait les frontières, il y a des barbelés, et j'avais inspiré ça. Je pensais que ça correspondait à mon histoire, et aussi je peux le transformer dans les vêtements. Après, je vous dis aussi, si vous voyez cette robe, c'est que c'est une robe fluide, un peu transparent. C'est que chez nous, les femmes, ils n'ont pas de liberté, ils ont vraiment, surtout en ce moment. Et en fait, on se bat toujours pour la liberté de femme. Et, parce on trouve que les femmes, ils ont le droit aussi de montrer leur corps ils ont le droit d'être libres. Et j'avais créé des collections par rapport à ça, en fait, les créations.
C'est très beau. Et donc là aussi, ça revient de la même collection?
Oui, de la même collection. Ça, c'était une robe avec des plumes de truche. Et en fait, c'était inspiré si vous voyez le dos, ça fait un peu sorte de montagne. C'était blanc, blanc, jaune, marron. En fait, c'était des étapes. Et j'avais inspiré aussi de cette collection Exode.
Super. Je trouve la question de la liberté de femme, évidemment, c'est passionnant et ça résonne aussi avec ce que Hayley et Jessica ont dit déjà aussi dans leurs remarques.
En fait, dans beaucoup de pays, comme j'ai vécu, comme l'Afghanistan, bon, c'est pire, mais l'Iran aussi, les femmes, ils sont voilées sur une voile tout entièrement noire. En Afghanistan, maintenant, c'est pire. Mais si vous voyez, ce que j'ai fait, c'est que, par exemple, la robe de mariée, c'était juste une robe spectaculaire. C'était brodée par une brodeuse de Jean-Paul Gaultier. Et si vous voyez, c'est un message à passer. Ça veut dire que la femme, elle était entourée de barbelés. Ça veut dire que comme une femme qui est cachée derrière une voile, elle est obligée. C'est qu'on on l'oblige. Et là, voilà, j'ai mis la femme tout bien sûr, en la respectant. C'était juste une robe simple, transparente, euh, mais classe. Et voilà, c'était juste un message à passer. Et dans notre pays, surtout dans notre pays ou dans des pays comme l'Iran, l'Afghanistan et tout, c'est osé. Et malheureusement.
Absolument, c'est très beau ce message.
C'est pareil, c'est une cape que j'avais créée avec des broderies barbelées tout entièrement dessus. Et en fait, c'est une cape qu'elle était portée avec un body. Et j'ai joué beaucoup sur des vêtements sexy, mais aussi le côté respectueux. Ça veut dire que les femmes étaient respectées, bien sûr, elles n'étaient pas vulgaires, pour vous dire.
Oui, tout à fait. Oh, pardon. Et donc, ça, c'est une collection plus récente?
Oui, ça, c'est une deuxième collection que j'avais fait. En fait, c'était collection androgyne que j'avais créé. C'était le deuxième, non, pardon, c'était le troisième collection. C'était la collection du voyage, parce que j'ai beaucoup voyagé depuis que je suis arrivé en France. La France, ça m'a permis de beaucoup voyager. Je suis allé en Chine, je suis allé aux États-Unis et tout. Et j'avais créé une collection de voyages. Je me suis inspiré un peu de tous les voyages que j'avais fait, de chaque chose comment on dit, chaque chose que j'ai appris. Et finalement, je l'ai exprimé sur les vêtements.
C'est vraiment intéressant de comprendre vos références. Et en fait, on comprend en vous écoutant que vous aussi, vous jouez beaucoup avec l'histoire. Et cet échange entre les cultures qu'on a évoqué avec Hayley, avec des créateurs comme Christian Dior, vous aussi, vous avez vos références qui informent vraiment votre travail, vos collections.
En fait, moi, comme je vous ai expliqué au début, quand j'étais gamin, j'ai pas été à l'école, j'ai fait que travailler. Et après, j'ai vécu aussi dans des pays qui n'étaient pas forcément libres, etc. Quand je suis arrivé en France, j'ai eu la liberté, j'ai pu m'exprimer, j'ai pu créer. Après, j'ai pas eu énormément de soutien, mais j'ai tout fait moi-même, entre guillemets, et pour essayer d'attirer les gens et essayer d'avancer. Parce que j'ai travaillé dans des grandes maisons, c'est vrai, mais j'ai pas voulu rester là-bas. Et j'avais envie de créer ma marque et faire ce que j'ai envie de faire. Mais finalement, c'est vrai qu'avec ce que j'avais, ce que je pu faire, j'ai fait quand même un petit chemin, on va dire. Parce que si on a les moyens de faire et si on a des gens qui nous soutiennent et on aura pu faire, on aura pu aller beaucoup plus loin. Mais aujourd'hui, quand même, je suis content de ce que j'ai fait et j'essaie bien sûr, j'essaie d'inventer des choses. Je cherche aussi de créer de nouvelles imaginations. C'est pas quelque chose de facile aussi. Mais
Bien sûr.
c'est vrai que
Bien
c'est...
sûr. Et c'est un chemin qui continue parce qu'on comprend que vous avez eu une belle collaboration avec le musée de Tours qui est en train de se faire actuellement.
Exactement, exactement. C'est un projet qui me plaît beaucoup parce que c'est vrai que moi, quand je suis arrivé, vous savez, quand je suis arrivé en France, je connaissais pas du tout ni Jean-Paul Gaultier, ni Jean Galliano, ni Dior, ni Chanel. Mais avec le temps, j'ai appris et j'ai compris que c'est des grandes marques de vêtements, etc., etc. Et comme Jessica, elle m'a contacté, je connaissais pas du tout François Boucher, et finalement, j'ai regardé ses tableaux, etc., ses peintres, et ça m'a beaucoup plu et ça m'a intéressé de faire une collaboration et de créer une pièce en inspirant de ces tableaux. Et c'est vrai que quand on regarde les tableaux, il y a beaucoup de couleurs, il y a beaucoup de fluides, il y a beaucoup de choses intéressantes on peut imaginer beaucoup de choses, mais aussi avec le temps, plus, comment on dit, euh, avec le temps, plus le, euh, le travail, mince, la, oh là là, j'ai oublié le mot. En fait, c'est quelque chose que ça me plaît et j'ai une équipe qui travaille dessus. On est 3 personnes qui travaillent parce que bien sûr, c'est quelque chose que ça me tient à cœur parce que c'est quand même pour un musée, c'est pas pour. Et on travaille dessus pour présenter une belle pièce qui va rester au musée, quoi.
C'est super. Et qui va entrer dans la collection permanente, je crois, après l'exposition.
Pardon?
Qui va entrer dans la collection après l'exposition de Jessica. Donc, c'est génial.
J'espère.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Sami. C'était passionnant de vous écouter.
Je suis désolé parce que je suis pas quelqu'un qui parle beaucoup et j'essaie d'expliquer un peu ce que je fais aussi. Mais bon, ce qui m'intéresse sur ce projet, là, on a quand même beaucoup avancé. Mais comme j'ai dit à Jessica, ça peut être bien que on vous garde la surprise.
Bien sûr. Il faut qu'on vienne au musée de Tours. C'est à partir d'octobre, votre exposition?
Alors, l'exposition ouvrira le 4 novembre.
Le 4 novembre. Donc, tout le monde
Ça sera
est
avec plaisir, en tout
averti.
cas.
Merci, Sami. Merci.
De rien, merci
on a
à vous.
hâte de
Merci
voir
beaucoup.
ce que vous allez faire. Merci.
Avec plaisir.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I think this was an absolutely fascinating talk. Huge thanks to our 3 participants, Jessica, Hayley, Sami. As I said, we'll all have to race to Jessica's exhibition, which I'm sure will be a huge success in November 2022 on Boucher, opera and theater, and of course to see what Sami has produced for it. I think it'll be absolutely beautiful, I have no doubt. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Merci,
much.
thank you.